let's go ahead and start the recording. And then we're going to go here. All right. Okay, so this particular chapter will correlate with chapter 16 in the Explorations textbook. So we're going to go over the last 10,000 years of human evolution. We'll look at the transition from hunting and gathering to practicing agriculture as the predominant mode of subsistence. And we'll look at how this is considered to be a fundamental threshold in the evolution of human society. So we know that the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, ended approximately 10,000 years ago. We are now in an interglacial period, which typically these periods last about 10 to 12,000 years. We know that during this time, during this initial transition, as we're coming out of the last Ice Age, obviously the climate became much warmer and more stable. We also see that carbon dioxide levels are rising, which allows for increased plant productivity and plant cultivation. So those of you that have studied photosynthesis know that during that process, plants will take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and they will let out oxygen for us. So we have this nice symbiotic relationship with plant life. They take in the carbon dioxide that we produce, and they give us back oxygen. So this is generally considered to be a very fundamental threshold in the evolution of human society, and can sometimes be considered to be one of the worst mistakes that humans ever made. And we'll talk about why, but know that this transition is not necessarily viewed as a positive one. And we certainly see some detrimental health occurrences happening during this time as well. So we'll look at why did humans decide to adopt agriculture? Essentially, why did they decide to abandon hunting and gathering in favor of sedentary agricultural strategies? So of course, there were environmental and climatic fluctuations that may have made this possible. A much warmer and stable climate makes it easier to cultivate crops, and also increases in human population size. All right. So we know during the early Holocene, so just to review, the Holocene is the last 10,000 years. So during the last 10,000 years, we've been in an interglacial period. So we've been in a period of relative warmth and stable climate. So during this time, hunter-gatherers in the early Holocene are still largely mainly nomadic. So that means that they're moving seasonally, following the migration patterns of the game animals that they're hunting, and the crops that they're, and the vegetation and tubers that they're gathering, essentially. So they're following the migration routes of their game. And during the Holocene and the early Neolithic, these human populations began to occupy temporary villages seasonally. But this transition did not happen drastically, and it did not happen overnight. Just like the transition from quadrupedalism to bipedalism didn't happen overnight, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture also did not happen overnight. It took thousands of years. So we see in the early Neolithic, we see evidence for year-round occupation of villages, but prior to that, it was really just seasonal. These early agriculturalists were likely practicing hunting and gathering during one season, and then only practicing intensified agriculture during others. So maybe during the warm season, they're growing crops, and then during the colder season, they're still hunting and gathering like they were when they were nomadic. So it's important to note that the Neolithic revolution or agricultural revolution may have not been a sudden or dramatic transition as once hypothesized. This was likely a gradual transition that took thousands of years, and it may have happened differently depending upon the geographic territory or region. All right, so let's look at some of the positives and negatives of this transition. So we're looking at the transition from hunting and gathering to practicing sedentary agriculture. So positive consequences, much more reliable food source. If you cultivate crops, and once you get good at it, you can create enough of a surplus to support a large population size for several years even. So this is very beneficial for humans in the sense of if all of a sudden a food source became unavailable or scarce, or there was some sort of climatic fluctuation that made a particular food source scarce, that we know we can still survive if we have this surplus. It also allowed for a more sedentary lifestyle. And now, of course, these early agriculturalists are still very active when they're out there cultivating crops and engaging in agriculture doesn't mean that they're sitting around all day. But what I mean is that it's more sedentary than it was before. They're not being required to travel 7-8 miles a day just to gather enough food for survival. It's a much more leisurely way of going about life. So the ability to create that food surplus allowed them to have more security. It allowed them to have more free time. They didn't have to spend every waking hour just making sure that they had the food to survive. They had time to engage in leisure activities. We see the emergence of more symbolic expression and art during this time. We also see the reduction or shorter birth intervals. So that's a term that's come up quite a bit this semester. That term birth interval simply means the period of time between birth A, birth B, birth C, so on and so forth. So when we were hunting and gathering, if you recall back to the human adaptation chapters and sections, we learned that when we're nomadic hunting and gathering, it's not necessarily beneficial for us to have a birth every year, every other year, or even every 3 years. It's much more beneficial to have a birth every 4 to 5 years. That way, that very dependent child has the opportunity to grow a little bit and become a little bit more independent. That way, the mother isn't trying to carry around multiple children and practice on-demand breastfeeding for those multiple children, all the while trying to gather enough food for survival. So for hunter-gatherers, it was much more beneficial to have a birth every 4 to 5 years. But as we transitioned to a more sedentary lifestyle, and we had a more reliable food source, and we had the ability to have these stationary sedentary villages where women could stay back and men could go out and gather the food or engage in cultivating the crops, it allowed for women to shorten their birth intervals. So all of a sudden, it did make sense for a woman to have a child every 2 years. So by shortening the birth interval, it actually increased fertility. So it allowed women to have births more frequently. It allowed them to be more successful, essentially, at being able to provide their children with adequate nutrition for survival. So with shorter birth intervals came an explosion in population size. So negative consequences of this transition, I put population increase here because even though that wasn't a huge issue 10,000 years ago, I could certainly say that is an issue today. We have over 8 billion people on the planet as of 2022. And I think everyone can agree that we're certainly in a circumstance where there are too many people on this planet for them all to survive. That's unfortunately the reality. We have exceeded the carrying capacity of our environment. We're destroying our environment. There's many people out there that don't have enough food to eat or territory to live in. And unfortunately, that problem will likely only get worse with the extreme weather we experience with climate change. Also, this transition brought along a lot of sanitation issues. So when we were hunting and gathering, if we needed to use the restroom, we quite simply use the restroom and keep going. But when we're living in a sedentary village, it now becomes an issue. We have to figure out how do we properly and effectively dispose not only of human waste, but also of animal waste. Because if we're starting to use animals for a food source and we're engaging in animal husbandry and the domestication of animals, we're also figuring out what to do with their waste and how to dispose of it in a sanitary way. Nutritional issues. So nutrition became an issue because now we're focusing in on just certain crops, just wheat or just barley or just rice, depending upon what territory you're in, obviously. But the early agriculturalists were focusing in on too few resources. They were consuming a lot of carbohydrates. And even though carbohydrates may be tasty, they do not give us enough nutrition. When we were hunting and gathering, we were eating a variety of things. We were eating vegetation, we were eating tubers, insects, meat, fruit when it was available. We had a varied, diverse diet. And then when we transitioned from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture, we're eating this very carbohydrate-rich, concentrated diet. So along with that, we're going to see a lot of nutritional deficiencies. So we can see there's a mark right around 10,000 years ago. We see an increase in dental caries or cavities. We see that stature dramatically declines. We see that there's an increase in infectious disease that leaves its mark on the bone. We see that there's a decrease in stature. Humans are getting shorter, and that's a big indicator of inadequate nutrition and prenatal care. We also see the emergence of social inequality. And sometimes when I first bring this up, it's a little bit confusing because it seems Why would social inequality be tied to the advent of agriculture? So the reason it's tied, or the reason that some theorists feel it's tied, is because prior to this, we were living in very egalitarian type social groups. Hunter-gatherers, even today, I won't say it's perfectly egalitarian, but even hunter-gatherer groups today do not have a whole lot of differences between the haves and have-nots. They, of course, have some degree of social hierarchy, like all primates do. They have, elders sometimes have more powers than others, and sometimes there's divisions based upon gender. But in general, they're far more egalitarian than state-level societies are, for example. So social inequality emerged because when we're living in sedentary villages, at least according to this hypothesis, it emerged because we started to acquire land and property. Prior to this, there was no benefit to acquiring land and property. We were moving around constantly, so it was not to our benefit to try to acquire any property, because that just meant more things for us to carry around. But now we're living in sedentary villages, we suddenly have this issue of land ownership. And of course, not all land is created equal. Some land will be more productive, some land will be near a water source, some land will be in a geographic territory that has more fertile soil or has greater access to animals that are easily domesticated. So not all land is created equal. So these humans, these early agriculturalists, are of course competing over access to the land that is the most desirable. So we see the emergence of leaders, we see the emergence of violence, we see the emergence of trade networks. We see a lot of things starting to happen for the first time, which, I'm not going to say it's all negative, but, many theorists do tie agriculture and inequality, the origins of inequality, together. All right, so we know that complex societies do not develop in isolation, they emerge as networks. So the Fertile Crescent, the region that we know today as the Middle East, is the region where we start to see these sedentary villages and early agricultural societies start to pop up all around each other. So this is going to require much more complex social organization. It's going to require the emergence of leaders, what we call aggrandizers. Like I mentioned before, we see the origins of inequality and property ownership. And because not all land is created equal, we see intergroup conflict over access to quality land and resources. We see evidence that this conflict would sometimes escalate into warfare between groups. So competition over territory, over resources, over land, this is something that's been going on for as long as history has been recorded, and something that continues today. And we also see the emergence of alliance formation and trade networks. So for example, maybe there's one group that's really good at cultivating wheat, and there's another group that's really great at domesticating cattle. And there's another group that's really great at cultivating barley. And then there's another group that's really great at domesticating goats. And then there's another group that's really great at producing the pottery that we need to store this grain and keep it dry. So we've got these networks, we've got all of these groups that are specializing in the cultivation of certain crops, or the domestication of certain animals, or the production of artifacts that we need, of products that we need to engage in these activities. So these groups are able to form these trade alliances and trade networks, and they're able to trade these products and goods with one another to benefit the entire social structure. So, but of course, along with these alliance formation and trade networks, we see the emergence of control and power as well. That these groups are wanting to, for the first time, have control and power over other groups by, restricting or allowing access to the resources that they're able to produce. All right, so we also, during this time frame, we see that we didn't observe symbolic expression in the fossil record beforehand. Of course we did, going back as early as the Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis. We certainly see evidence for symbolic expression, cave art, statuettes, the use of face paint, even like we talked about with the Neanderthals, the use of the red ochre to paint their faces potentially. So we certainly see that well before 10,000 years ago, but we see that there's somewhat of an explosion of it starting about 10,000 years ago. And generally the theory is not that humans didn't have the capacity for this prior to 10,000 years ago. It's that, once we see this transition, we're seeing that humans have more time for it, essentially. So just to give a little history on, what I mean when I say cave arts or cave painting, we see the emergence of cave art and cave painting in Europe and Africa about 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, and also in Australia about 30,000 to 50,000 years before present. So the cave art that we see in Europe and Africa tends to depict animals and weapons, because in that territory, they were likely engaging in, during this time frame, they were engaging in quite a bit of hunting medium to large size game animals. So maybe this cave art was used to inspire a successful hunt or create a successful hunt, essentially as a good luck charm. And we see that, they're depicting the animals that they were likely hunting and likely relying upon pretty heavily for their survival. And then in Australia, we see that the cave art is a little bit different. We see these anthropomorphic kind of stick figure drawings of animals and humans. So they're kind of a hybridization of animal and human. And we know, based upon what we see in modern day Australian Aborigines, that they believe that there is a connection between humans, animals, and the environment. So we have the spirit world connection. So modern Australian Aborigines create art, cave art, that represents what they call the dreaming time. So the dreaming time is a primordial time when the world was first being formed, and the spirits alive during the dreaming time created the features of the landscape and the human beings around them. So Australian Aboriginal religions really see this deep connection between modern day humans and their ancestors. And it ultimately, when you think about it, a belief in spirituality in that way really creates this ultimate respect for everything around you. If you believe that your ancestors quite literally created the earth, created all the mountains, the streams, the valleys, the everything around you, essentially. If you believe that your ancestors quite literally created it, then you have this ultimate respect for it. So it taught people the important elements of their culture and beliefs. All right, so these are just some more examples of what I mean when I say cave art and artistic expression, symbolic expression. This is Chauvet Cave in France that dates back about 32 to 30,000 years before present. So again, you're seeing these depictions of animals that they would have been hunting, or possibly animals that were hunting them. So, just this keen awareness of their surroundings and keen awareness of, their reliance upon these animals for their survival. This is the Hall of Bulls in Lascaux Cave in France, dating back about 12,000 to 17,000 years before present. So you're seeing more depictions of animals that they were relying upon. More of the Hall of Bulls. All right, so another thing that we start to see, and the video that you watched for your discussion at the end of last week, the First Peoples documentary, also touched on this as well, the Venus figurines. There's many different Venus figurines. There's a Venus of Willendorf, and basically the most fascinating thing about these figurines is we see similar depictions happening in multiple geographic territories. It's not like we just see these figurines in Europe. We see them in parts of Asia and Africa. We see these Venus figurines popping up all over the place. We see a concentration of them in Europe, but it doesn't mean that we're not seeing similar figurines and statuettes from other regions around the old world. So there's various theories and hypotheses, of course, on what these figurines might represent. So it's very possible, of course, that this is a fertility figurine, that it's representing fertility or promoting fertility and representing healthy pregnant women. So you see, kind of certain features emphasized. They've also been interpreted as erotic representations. So I guess, prehistoric porn, I guess, is what they're getting at there. Or even as self-portraits. So, of course, it's all up to interpretation exactly what these figurines represent, or maybe they represent all of these things. But it is certainly interesting that we see similar depictions of the female form popping up in different regions around the old world. All right, those are just some more examples of a Venus figurine. There's got the Venus of Willendorf there. That's a very famous one. All right, and this one here, these are Neolithic plastered skulls from Jericho. I'm just showing you some examples of the type of art that's popping up around the Neolithic Revolution. And of course, pottery. So that may not seem like a particularly beautiful piece of art there, but it is functional. Because remember, during this time frame, we're for the first time starting to live in sedentary villages. We're starting to cultivate crops. And it's only beneficial, it only can create a surplus if we can keep those crops dry, if we can prevent them from getting wet and getting moldy and spoiling. So we now need storage containers. We need storage containers that are going to keep our crops dry and prevent them from getting mold and from going bad. So pottery is an excellent mechanism and an excellent vehicle for carrying water from one place to another, for carrying crops, for storing crops. So pottery was not just about artistic expression, but also about functionality. All right, so let's look at the scenarios. So essentially, what came first? Did a large population size come first, or did agriculture come first? Now, and it's very possible that this happened in different ways depending upon what territory we're talking about. Now, at least according to the archaeological record, and at least, in my opinion, common sense, I think scenario 2 makes a lot more sense, and I'll tell you why. But let's look at both first. So scenario 1 is basically stating that a large population size came first, which created the need for human groups to intensify their subsistence strategies in order to survive. So essentially, a larger population size forced humans to somewhat abandon hunting and gathering and find a more effective way at making food, producing food, and making sure that we have enough food. So it created the need for a surplus and created the need for food storage in times of shortage. So scenario 2 is basically the opposite. Scenario 2 is saying that agriculture came first, and then the explosion in population size came later. So hunting and gathering is a very nomadic lifestyle. So as we transitioned from hunting and gathering, it allowed for a more sedentary lifestyle. It allowed for us to essentially, like I mentioned before, create year-round villages, the occupation of year-round villages. It allowed women to essentially focus in more on childcare and be able to reduce their birth intervals. They're not quite as engaged in just gathering enough food for survival as they go day to day. They're able to, have a home base essentially. And because there's a food surplus, they're, not so worried about having a child every other year, for example. They're not feeling like it's more beneficial to have a child every 4 or 5 years. It's now becoming beneficial and possible to have a child every couple of years. And additionally, when you're hunting and gathering and you're practicing on-demand breastfeeding, sometimes you're not even going back into that cycle, that 28-day cycle of menstruation and ovulation. You're not going back into that cycle when you're traveling so far each day and practicing on-demand breastfeeding. So this sedentary lifestyle allowed us to shorten our birth intervals. It provided a reliable food source and even a food surplus. And ultimately, all of these factors that I just mentioned led to the larger population size over time. So generally, scenario 2 is the more accepted one when it comes to essentially why did this transition happen? Why did we decide to abandon hunting and gathering and adopt agriculture? All right, so let's watch a little film clip. This is going to kind of paint the picture for you of what it might have looked like. So again, it's important to remember that this transition was a gradual one. In the very beginning, the earliest agriculturalists were likely doing both. They were hunting and gathering during some seasons, probably during the colder season, they were hunting and gathering. And then during the warmer season, they were occupying temporary villages and engaging in, intensified cultivation and domestication of both plants and animals. But they were doing both. They didn't make this transition overnight. It likely took thousands of years, and it likely occurred in slightly different ways depending upon what territory we're talking about. So this video clip, I like it because it does a nice job of kind of painting the picture for you and showing you how this might have occurred. So think about, as you're watching, think about what are the benefits. Essentially, what would be the motivating factor? Why would a human population want to make this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture? Try to think of 3 benefits, 3 reasons why humans would have made this transition as you're watching, and then we'll talk about it. Okay.
End of the last ice age.
Sorry, let me make sure the volume is at a good level here. Turn it up just a skosh.
It's the end of the last ice age. Our ancestors have survived this freezing desolation for 25,000 years. They are hunter-gatherers. They travel light, their children with them, one meal away from starvation. They are never able to settle down. But these nomads are about to change the world. Their Stone Age revolution will make our civilization possible. They will set humanity on the long journey to the modern world. Around 15,000 years ago, the climate began to change. The glaciers melted, and with water, the world came back to life. One of the best places for humans to live now was an area of the Middle East we call the Fertile Crescent, from Israel to Iraq. The hills were dotted with trees, which spread quickly as the weather improved. The open woodlands were like a garden, supporting a new range of edible plants. Animals flourished on the uplands and fertile plains. It was a hunter-gatherer's paradise. It was here the travelling bands found something completely new, which would change humanity forever. They discovered a huge family of plants, the grasses. It was a vast supply of grain. This was the spark which would make human progress possible. The evidence is scattered in valleys across the Fertile Crescent. These people left no recorded language or stories. All the archaeologists can do is dig. In the 1920s, the first great woman archaeologist, Dorothy Garrod, carried out excavations around Mount Carmel in Israel. She was looking in caves she thought had been used 50,000 years earlier. Instead, she unearthed the body of a man buried around 12,000 years ago. He was curled up, wearing a beautifully crafted headband decorated with pipe-like seashell. It was so distinctive, Garrod believed she had discovered a new people. She named them the Natufians. As she kept digging, she found something researchers had never seen before. It was a tool with a bone handle. It held a line of sharp flint blades. They were coated with a shiny residue, traces of a wild grass, an ancient form of wheat. It was a sickle, a tool designed especially for cutting grass. So Dorothy Garrod knew the Natufians were collecting the new grass foods in large quantities. At the same time each year, these ancient people would have found the ripening grass in huge areas. Many of them were not edible, but they managed to select all the useful species. Now they had barley and wheat. But they were travelers, working together in small family groups. they had to carry everything they harvested. This burden would ultimately change their way of life. Today, the land of the Natufians is drier and hotter. The past is waiting to be discovered just beneath a forbidding surface. Here, at Wadi Hamma, in northern Jordan, the Natufians left minute traces of their lives. Archaeologist Philip Edwards has found evidence that these nomads had everything they needed in one place.
They're well placed here. They're on water and they are positioned between the lowlands of the Jordan Valley and the uplands of the Mediterranean hills behind. In fact, the Jordan Valley, when the Natufian people were here, was filled by a lake, Lake Luzan, which extended right up and right past the scene here. And looking over that, we would see, if it was a clearer day, Mount Carmel peeping out on the coast, the site where the Natufian was discovered originally by Dorothy Garrod.
Archaeologists estimate there were no more than 1,000 families living in the whole of Israel and Jordan at the time. There was enough grain to feed them well, and it was all growing wild.
Now, archaeologists have experimented in harvesting wild cereals in their natural area in the Middle East. And what they found is that one person harvesting for a period of about 3 weeks can produce enough food to feed a family of 4 for a whole year.
These ancient grasses are the forerunners of modern crops. The grains discovered by the Natufians still feed more than half the world's population today. Of all the things they ate, grain was unique in one vital way. It did not decay. Keep it dry, and it lasts for decades. For the first time, they had food they could rely on for long periods of time. Now, they needed to store their grain. There was a reason to stay in one place. This was the first time in the Middle East we know people built shelters to last from year to year. And they remained here from generation to generation down the centuries. They chose their sites carefully. Many had low stone walls. Their remains can be found all.
All right, so what we're going to do next, let's go into our breakout rooms. All right, let's go ahead and pause our recording here.